The name Emma Grady sat at the very bottom of the boarding house register like an afterthought, written in faded ink between a traveling preacher and a widow who sold quilts. And yet it was the only name that Arthur Warren asked for when he rode into Harlan Creek, Texas, on a blazing Thursday afternoon in the summer of 1879. The town of Harlan Creek was not what most people would call remarkable. It sat along a dry stretch of land about 40 miles southeast of Abilene, the kind of place that existed because the cattle drives needed a water stop, and the railroad had promised a spur line that never quite arrived. There was a main street with packed dirt and horse tracks baked hard as iron in the summer heat, a general store run by a man named Horace Pell who charged too much for everything and apologized for nothing, a saloon called the Dusty Crown that smelled of sawdust and regret, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and Mrs. Hartley's boarding house, which was the social nerve center of the town, even if Mrs. Hartley herself would never have admitted to anything so dramatic. It was in that boarding house, in a small room at the back end of the second floor that caught the full force of the afternoon sun, that Emma Grady had lived for the better part of a year. She was 24 years old, unremarkable in the way that a piece of good furniture is unremarkable, solid, useful, honest, and overlooked in favor of something shinier across the room. She had brown hair the color of creek mud after a rain, eyes that were more gray than blue depending on the light, and hands that had known work since she was old enough to grip a broom handle. She was not the sort of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room, and she had long since made her peace with that particular fact of her life. She kept to herself, mostly. She worked as a seamstress out of Mrs. Hartley's front parlor during the day, and in the evenings she read whatever books the traveling merchants left behind in exchange for a mended jacket or a repaired saddle bag. People in Harlan Creek knew Emma Grady the way you know the sound of the wind. It was there, it was reliable, it did not ask for anything, and most days you simply did not notice it. Arthur Warren changed all of that. He rode in on a bay horse that was tired but well cared for, the kind of animal that told you something important about the man riding it. He was broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men get when they spend more time working than eating, somewhere around 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 3 days of stubble. He wore a plain brown coat over a collarless shirt, and he had a Colt revolver on his hip that he did not touch once during his entire first day in town, which the men around the Dusty Crown noted and discussed with some suspicion. A man who didn't fidget with his gun in a new town was either very confident or very dangerous, and they couldn't quite decide which applied to Arthur Warren. He did not go to the saloon first, the way most traveling men did. He tied his horse at the post outside Mrs. Hartley's boarding house, carried in a single leather saddlebag, and stood at the front desk where Mrs. Hartley herself was writing in her register with the careful penmanship of a woman who took her record seriously. "I need a room," Arthur said. His voice was low and even, with a slight Texas drawl that told her he was from somewhere near but not here. "I have one room available," Mrs. Hartley said, without looking up. $2 a week, meals included. Supper at 6, breakfast at 7. I don't allow drinking in the rooms, and I don't allow company after 8 in the evening. "That'll do fine," he said. Then, before she had turned the register around for him to sign, he asked, "Is there a woman named Emma Grady staying here?" Mrs. Hartley looked up then. She had small, sharp eyes that had seen a great deal in her 63 years, and she used them now with professional precision. "There is," she said carefully. "May I ask your business with her?" "I'd like to speak with her," Arthur said, "if she's willing. And if she's not, then I'll leave her alone." Mrs. Hartley held his gaze for a moment longer, decided something, and turned the register around. He signed his name in clean, clear letters. Arthur Warren. She looked at it, looked back at him, and showed him to his room without another word on the subject. The whole exchange took less than 10 minutes, but by supper time, Half the town somehow knew that a stranger had ridden in and asked for Emma Grady by name, and nobody could account for why. Emma herself did not know any of this until Mrs. Hartley knocked on her workroom door at 4:30, when the seamstress was hunched over a particularly difficult bit of lacework on a dress collar for Reverend Tillman's wife. "You have a caller," Mrs. Hartley said, and her tone was precise in the way a doctor's tone is precise when delivering news that could go either way. Emma set down her needle. "I beg your pardon. A man has checked into the boarding house. He asked for you by name." Mrs. Hartley folded her hands in front of her. "His name is Arthur Warren. He says he wishes to speak with you if you're willing. I told him it was your choice entirely." Emma stared at her. The name meant nothing. It stirred no memory, no recognition, not even a flicker of familiarity. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said. "I didn't suppose you did," Mrs. Hartley replied. "But he seems decent enough for whatever that is worth. He's in room 4. I told him you'd come if you wanted to." Emma sat very still for a moment, listening to the dry wind press against the window glass. Then she set her lacework aside, smoothed her dress, and went to room 4. She knocked twice, heard a single movement inside, and then the door opened and she was looking at Arthur Warren for the first time. He looked at her the way people look at something they have been searching for, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet relief that is almost embarrassing in its honesty. "Miss Grady," he said, "thank you for coming. My name is Arthur Warren. I knew your brother, Thomas." The air went out of the hallway. Emma Grady had one brother, Thomas, and Thomas Grady had died 14 months ago in a cattle drive accident outside of Amarillo. She had received a letter, a brief and impersonal letter from the drive foreman, informing her that Thomas had been lost crossing a flooded river and that his personal effects were being held until someone claimed them. She had written back twice and received no reply. She had grieved alone in her small back room and then gone on with the business of being alive, the way you do when there is no other choice. "You knew Thomas," she said. Her voice was very flat. "I rode with him for 2 seasons, Arthur said. "He was one of the best men I ever worked alongside. When he died, I was there." He paused. "I promised him something, Miss Grady, and I've taken too long to keep it, but I'm here now." She looked at him for a long moment, and because she was not the kind of woman who fell apart in doorways, she simply said, "You had better come in and tell me everything." He did. Arthur Warren had come from a small ranch east of Sweetwater, the third son of a ranching family with more land than money and more pride than either. He had gone to work the Kishom Trail drives at 22 because the ranch could not support 3 sons and he was the youngest. He had met Thomas Grady on his second drive, when Thomas had pulled him out of a disagreement with a trail boss that would have gone badly wrong. They had ridden together after that through 2 long seasons of dust and heat, and the particular loneliness that men on the trail carry quietly alongside everything else. Thomas Grady, Arthur told her, had spoken about his sister constantly, about how she was the most capable and overlooked person he had ever known, about how their mother had died when Emma was 16 and their father 2 years after that, and how Emma had taken in sewing work and kept herself upright through sheer stubborn will. Thomas had wanted to come back to her, had talked about finding a piece of land somewhere decent and bringing his sister out to have a proper home. He had never stopped talking about it, right up until the last week of his life. When Thomas died, he had been swept from his horse in the flooded crossing of the Canadian River, had gone under fast, and Arthur had gone in after him and pulled him out, but it was already too late. Arthur had held him while he died on the bank with mud and river water everywhere, and Thomas had gripped his arm and made him promise to find Emma and make sure she was all right. "He said you'd be somewhere mending things and pretending you didn't need anyone," Arthur said. His voice was steady, but she could see what it cost him to keep it that way. "He said to tell you that he was sorry he never came back." Emma sat with her hands in her lap and her face very still, and she did not say anything for a long time. Outside the window, the dry Texas wind moved the dust around, and a horse somewhere complained about something, and the sound of the Dusty Crown's piano drifted faintly up the street. "He was always going to come back," she finally said, very quietly. He always said so. He meant it, Arthur said. Every time. She looked up then, and her gray-blue eyes were bright but dry, and she said something that surprised him. "Thank you for being with him. At the end, I was afraid he was alone." Arthur nodded once, and something in his expression shifted in a way he couldn't control. She asked him then, practically, because she was a practical woman, how he had found her. He explained that it had taken him the better part of a year, that he had started in Amarillo, where the drive had ended, and worked his way through every town and settlement and railroad stop where a young woman alone might have landed, asking the same question everywhere, checking boarding house registers and general store accounts and church records. Emma Grady was not an unusual name, but the particular Emma Grady he was looking for had been elusive. He had found 3 wrong ones before a man in a supply town 20 miles east had mentioned a seamstress in Harlan Creek with that name. "You searched for a year," Emma said. "It was not quite a question." "I made a promise," Arthur said simply. She studied him for a moment. "And now that you found me, what did you promise exactly?" "That I'd make sure you were all right," he said. "Are you?" She looked around the small room, at the quilted coverlet on the narrow bed, the stack of books on the windowsill, the single oil lamp, the dress she'd been altering that was folded on the chair. "I manage," she said. "That's not the same thing," he said gently. She couldn't argue with that, so she didn't. Supper at Mrs. Hartley's that evening was a stiff and watchful affair. There were 4 other boarders: a traveling dry goods salesman named Mr. Ott, a young telegraph operator named Clarence who had come to lay the new line through town, a widow named Mrs. Dupree who had been there since before Emma arrived, and now Arthur Warren, who sat across the table from Emma, and passed her the bread basket with the same quiet directness he seemed to apply to everything. Mrs. Dupree, who was 67 and had absolutely no interest in keeping her observations to herself, said before the potatoes had even been served, "So you knew her brother, Mr. Warren. What exactly are your intentions now?" The table went very still. Mr. Ott found something interesting to look at on his fork. Clarence, the telegraph operator, turned faintly pink. Arthur Warren looked across at Emma first, as if checking whether he had her permission to answer, and then he looked back at Mrs. Dupree and said with complete composure, "To make sure she has what she needs. That's all." Said Mrs. Dupree, which in her vocabulary covered a range of opinions roughly the size of a cattle herd. Emma said nothing, but she noted the fact that he had looked at her first. The next morning Arthur was up before breakfast, and Emma, who had the habit of rising early to get the good light for fine sewing, found him sitting on the front porch steps with a cup of coffee, watching the town come awake. The sun was just hitting the tops of the buildings across the street, and the shadows were long and sharp, and there was a brief, cool quality to the air that would be entirely gone by 10 o'clock. "You can sit," he said, without turning around, which told her he had heard her coming down the stairs despite the fact that she thought she was quiet. She sat on the step beside him, which was close because the porch steps were narrow, and accepted the second cup of coffee he handed her from the small tray Mrs. Hartley always put out at first light. "What will you do?" she asked, "now that you've found me?" "I don't have any particular plan beyond that," he admitted. He looked out at the street. "I thought I'd stay a few days, make sure you really are all right and not just saying so." "I'm not particularly fragile," she said. "Thomas never said you were," Arthur replied. "He said you were stubborn. He said it with considerable admiration." That made something shift in her chest, a small warm pressure that she had not expected. "Were you planning to go back to ranching?" she asked. "I've been thinking about land," he said. "There's good grazing land about 12 miles northwest of here. I passed through it coming in. Creek water still running, which is more than most land around here has. I've been saving for a few years." She turned to look at him. "You're thinking of settling here?" He met her look without flinching. "I don't have a reason not to." She didn't know what to say to that, so she drank her coffee and watched Horace Pell open up his general store across the way, moving with the particular slowness of a man who had been doing the same thing at the same time every day for 20 years and saw no reason to vary the pace. The town of Harlan Creek, meanwhile, was doing what small towns always do when something interesting happens. It talked. At the barbershop that morning, three men discussed who Arthur Warren might be and what his game was. At the general store, Horace Pell asked Mrs. Hartley directly whether the stranger was courting Emma Grady, and Mrs. Hartley told him it was none of his business, which he took as confirmation. At the Dusty Crown, the saloon keeper, a big man named Cutter who had opinions about everything, said that it was peculiar, a man coming to a place specifically to call on a woman as plain and quiet as Emma Grady, when there were prettier and more sociable women available. He said it with the casual cruelty of a man who had never thought carefully about his words in his life. What Cutter did not know, and what most of Harlan Creek did not know, was that Emma Grady heard most of what was said about her. Small towns have thin walls, and she had been living in one long enough to know which windows to avoid walking past and which conversations carried in the dry air. She had heard herself described as plain and quiet and unremarkable more times than she could count, and she had made herself a kind of armor out of not caring, which is different from actually not caring, though she would not have admitted the difference to anyone. She heard about what Cutter said from Clarence, the telegraph operator, who told her at supper with the apologetic guilt of a person who knows they are delivering bad news but cannot help themselves. She thanked him and said it didn't matter, and it didn't, not exactly, but it sat in her stomach in an unpleasant way all the same. Arthur was not at supper that evening. She found out later from Mrs. Hartley that he had gone to the county land office in the next town over, which was 15 miles east, to make inquiries about the grazing land he'd mentioned. He came back after dark, dusty from the road, and knocked on the parlor door where Emma was still working by lamplight on a complicated shirt for Mr. Ott, who had split a seam. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "You're not," she said. "Did you find what you needed?" "The land's available," he said. He had that quality again of carefully not showing how much something mattered to him. Good price, too. The railroad spur they were counting on didn't come through, so the land agent is eager to sell. She looked at him steadily. "You're going to buy it?" "I'm thinking about it seriously," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to ask you something, Miss Grady, and I want you to understand that you don't owe me any particular answer, and I won't think less of you whatever you say." She set down her sewing needle. "All right. Would it bother you," he said carefully, "if I stayed in this town for a while? I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I came here because of Thomas, and I meant what I said, that I just want to be sure you're all right. But I also don't want to impose on your life or make things awkward for you." Emma Grady sat for a moment with her hands folded over the half-mended shirt in her lap, and she thought about Thomas, who had always been the warm and sociable one, who had known how to fill a room and make people feel glad they were in it. She thought about the year since he died, and the loneliness of it, which she had managed but not enjoyed. She thought about this quiet, careful man who had spent a year keeping a promise to a dead friend and who looked at her with the steady attention of someone who was actually seeing her. "I wouldn't be bothered," she said. "I'd like it, actually, if you stayed." He nodded once, and she could see that he was relieved, though he kept it very contained. "Good," he said. "Then I'll stay." He bought the land 6 days later. It was 320 acres of rolling Texas grassland, with a spring-fed creek cutting through the middle of it, and a stand of cottonwood trees along the eastern edge that turned silver in the wind. The buildings were going to be a project. There was nothing on the property yet but a falling-down dugout that some earlier homesteader had abandoned, and the land needed fencing and clearing, and all of the endless patient work that goes into turning raw ground into something livable. He told Emma about all of it over breakfast the morning after he signed the papers, with a kind of careful enthusiasm that she found deeply endearing, as if he were not quite sure he was allowed to be excited and was rationing it just in case. "The creek runs year-round," he said, "at least according to the land agent, and the ground around it is soft enough that it's clearly been running a good long time. That's the most important thing for cattle. "What kind of cattle are you planning?" she asked. "Longhorn to start," he said. "Hardy and cheap, and they know how to find their own water. Later, maybe crossbreed for better beef, but that takes years and money I don't have yet." "You'll need hands," she said, "at least two to manage that much land alone." He looked at her with a slight smile that was so brief she almost missed it. "You know about ranching?" "Thomas talked," she said simply. "A great deal. For years." He laughed then, a low, genuine laugh that was the first time she had heard it, and she found that it rearranged something in her understanding of him. He had a good laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made a room feel larger. Over the following weeks, Arthur Warren became a fixture in Harlan Creek in the way that quiet, competent men become fixtures gradually, without drama, through the simple mechanism of being useful and reliable. He started work on the ranch, which he had not yet named, riding out each morning before the sun was fully up and returning in the evenings tired and dirty and satisfied in the way that physical work satisfies. He hired two men, a weathered Mexican vaquero named Domingo, who had been working odd jobs in town since his previous employer had gone bankrupt, and a young man of 22 named Will Birch, who had come up from San Antonio looking for steady work and had the particular quality of being both willing and unafraid of learning. The town's opinion of Arthur Warren shifted incrementally, in the way that small-town opinions shift, not all at once, but in small adjustments, like fence posts being straightened one at a time. Horace Pell, who had initially been suspicious, became considerably more favorable when Arthur began buying his supplies at the general store with cash and without complaint about the prices. Reverend Tillman, who noticed that Arthur attended Sunday services regularly and sat in the third row without fidgeting, approved of him thoroughly. Even the men at the Dusty Crown, who had initially been watchful, began to relax when it became clear that Arthur Warren was exactly what he appeared to be, a serious man who was building something and had no interest in other people's trouble. The one person whose opinion had not shifted was Cutter, the saloon owner, who continued to find Arthur Warren vaguely irritating in the way that simple men find complicated things irritating. Cutter had taken a liking to Emma Grady himself, in the proprietary way that certain men develop feelings for the least powerful woman in the room, and he did not appreciate the competition, though he would not have called it that. He made a point of stopping Emma in the street on 2 occasions to speak at length about how building a ranch was an uncertain business, and how a man might have fine intentions and still fail, and how a woman in Emma's position needed to be practical. Emma heard him out both times with patient attention, and then said something polite and moved on, which was one of her gifts. She told Arthur about it once, in a matter-of-fact way, not as a complaint but as information. They were sitting on the front porch of the boarding house in the early evening, which had become a quiet habit of theirs, each with a cup of coffee or sometimes, in the warmth, a glass of cold water from Mrs. Hartley's pitcher. "He's concerned for your welfare," Arthur said, and his tone was so perfectly neutral that she could not tell whether he meant it or was being wry. She looked at him sideways. "He's concerned for his own," she said. Arthur was quiet for a moment. "Has he bothered you, beyond talking?" "No," she said. "He's more talk than action. I've known the type." He nodded, and she could see him filing the information away without making it larger than it needed to be, which she appreciated. She did not need protecting from Cutter's idle talk, and the fact that Arthur understood that he did not immediately leap to some dramatic declaration of intervention, made her think more highly of him than any grand gesture could have. They talked a great deal in those evening hours. Not always about important things, sometimes about the book she was reading, sometimes about the technical business of fencing and cattle management, sometimes about the town and its characters, who were numerous and colorful. But gradually, in the way that conversations between two honest people who are paying attention to each other always do, the talking went deeper. She told him about her childhood, about the small farm in East Texas where she and Thomas had grown up, about their mother who had been warm and capable and gone too soon, about their father who had been a decent man undone by grief in a slow and quiet way. She told him about the years after, about learning to sew because it was the most portable trade a woman could have, about moving from town to town following whatever work there was, about arriving in Harlan Creek almost by accident a year ago when she had stopped for the night, and found that Mrs. Hartley needed someone and she needed somewhere. He told her about Sweetwater, about growing up the third son, which was its own particular kind of invisible, about learning to read from a mail order book his mother had sent for, because the nearest school was too far, about going on the trail drives not with any great adventure in his heart, but with a practical recognition that he needed to make his own way, about Thomas, about the specific friendship that forms between men on the trail, built out of shared hardship and long silences, and the occasional piece of honesty that the trail somehow made easier to speak. "He loved you very much," Arthur said one evening, about 3 weeks after he had arrived. The sun was going down in that spectacular way it does in Texas, painting everything orange and deep purple, and the shadows were long and soft. "I know," Emma said. "I loved him too, I still do." She paused. "It's strange, isn't it, how the love doesn't stop just because the person does." "No," Arthur said quietly, "it doesn't stop." There was a silence between them that was not empty but full, the kind of silence that happens between people who understand each other. She looked at him then, and noticed something she had been noticing for a while without acknowledging it, that she was always aware of exactly where he was in a room, that she listened for his footsteps on the stairs in the morning, that when he was not around there was a particular quality to the day that was a little flatter and less interesting. She noticed these things the way you notice a change in the weather before you can name what's coming. She was practical enough to know what it meant. She was also practical enough to be cautious with it. About a month after Arthur arrived, a Thursday afternoon brought a development that nobody had been expecting. A man rode into Harlan Creek from the direction of Sweetwater, and he was asking for Arthur Warren with a face like a storm coming in from the west. His name was Gerald Cross, and he was the sort of man that a town like Harlan Creek had seen before, not quite an outlaw, not quite honest, with a grievance that he wore like a second coat. Emma was crossing the street from the general store to the boarding house when she saw Gerald Cross dismount outside the Dusty Crown and heard him announce, to no one in particular and everyone in earshot, that he had business with a man named Warren, and that business was going to get settled today. She went directly to find Arthur, who was at the land office speaking with the county surveyor about the property boundaries. She did not run, because running attracted attention and attracted trouble, but she walked fast. Arthur's reaction to the news was entirely calm. He thanked the surveyor, said he'd finish their conversation another time, and walked outside with Emma. "What exactly does Gerald Cross want with you?" she asked, walking beside him back down the main street. "He claims I owe him money from a card game 3 years ago in Amarillo," Arthur said. "I don't, but he believes I do, and he's the sort of man who doesn't distinguish between believing something and it being true." "Should I be concerned?" she asked directly. He glanced at her. "No, this is going to be settled with words, not guns." "How can you be certain?" "Because Gerald Cross is loud and he's not brave," Arthur said simply. "He traveled 200 miles to say something angry in a public place. If he intended anything beyond that, he'd have come at night." He was right. The confrontation that happened outside the Dusty Crown was entirely verbal, and while Gerald Cross's voice was considerably louder than the occasion required, and while he said several things that were unpleasant and several more that were untrue, Arthur Warren stood and listened to all of it with the quiet steadiness of a man who has nothing to hide. And when Gerald Cross was done, Arthur said with perfect calm that if Gerald had a legitimate claim he was welcome to take it to a court. And that until then he had nothing more to say on the subject. Gerald Cross called him several names, received no reaction, kicked the hitching post once for emphasis, and then got back on his horse and rode out of Harlan Creek. The whole town watched from various positions of interested pretense, and it was agreed afterward, over supper tables and across store counters, that Arthur Warren had handled it well. Cutter, behind his bar, was not entirely satisfied by this assessment, but he kept that opinion to himself for once. Emma had watched from across the street, and when Arthur came back to the boarding house that evening and found her in the parlor, she looked up from her sewing and said, "You handled that well." "It wasn't difficult," he said. "Empty vessels make the most noise." "Thomas used to say that," she said, and her voice went soft. "I know," Arthur said. "He said it about me once when I was young and foolish. I took it to heart." She set down her work and looked at him properly. He was standing in the doorway, still dusty from the street, with that particular quality of composed tiredness that she had come to associate with him, and she felt the full weight of what she had been feeling and had not yet said to herself clearly. She was in love with him. She sat with that knowledge quietly for a moment, the way you sit with a fire that has just caught, warmly, carefully, not yet sure how big it's going to get. She said nothing about it that evening. She was not a woman who acted on things until she was sure, and sure to Emma Grady meant not just knowing her own feelings but understanding the ground she was standing on. The ground she was not yet sure of. What she knew was that Arthur Warren had come here for Thomas, that he was a good man keeping a promise, that he had bought land and was building something real, that he talked to her the way nobody else had ever talked to her, as if her opinions were worth hearing, as if what she thought about things mattered. But knowing his character was not the same as knowing his heart, and Emma did not intend to make a fool of herself over a man who might think of her as nothing more than a duty fulfilled. She decided to pay attention, to watch, to be sure. Over the next several weeks the evidence accumulated. It accumulated in small things, which are, in Emma's experience, always the most reliable kind of evidence. It was in the way he brought her a book he had found in the traveling merchant's cart, a novel she had mentioned wanting to read 2 weeks earlier, and he had remembered. It was in the way he adjusted his chair at the supper table so that she was not in the draught from the window, without saying anything about it. It was in the way he asked her opinion, genuinely asked it, about whether the north pasture or the south pasture was better for a first cattle holding, and then listened to her reasoning with his whole attention and changed his plan based on what she said. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking. She caught him at it twice. Once when she was helping Mrs. Hartley hang the washing, and she turned suddenly and found him watching from the gate with an expression on his face that was unguarded in a way she had not seen before, something warm and quiet and entirely, unmistakably specific to her. He composed his face quickly when he saw that she'd seen him, and she looked away and said nothing, but her heart had kicked hard in her chest and would not settle down for an hour. The second time was at the church Sunday service, when Reverend Tillman was reading from the book of Ruth, and she looked up from her hymnal and found Arthur watching her from 3 pews back, and this time neither of them looked away immediately. They held each other's gaze for a moment that lasted just a breath or two longer than was strictly proper, and then Reverend Tillman said something that required the congregation to stand, and the moment dissolved into the rustle of people rising. But it had happened, and Emma Grady, who had spent her life being careful with herself, felt something begin to move in her that she had kept very still for a very long time. She was mending one of Arthur's shirts. He had brought a small pile of darning over from the ranch on a Saturday, paying her for the work the same as any customer, which was both entirely appropriate and somehow the most intimate thing that had happened between them, having his shirts in her hands. When Mrs. Dupree came into the parlor and sat down with the decisive energy of a woman who has decided to say something and is not going to be deterred. "That man is in love with you," Mrs. Dupree said without preamble. Emma did not look up from the shirt. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Dupree." "Don't good afternoon me," said Mrs. Dupree. "I'm 67 years old and I've been watching people my entire life, and I know what I see. Arthur Warren looks at you like you're the answer to a question he's been asking for years. Mrs. Dupree, Emma said calmly, you are very kind, but I'm not kind, Mrs. Dupree said firmly. I'm accurate. There's a difference. And the other thing I see is that you look at him the same way, only you're better at hiding it because you've had more practice hiding things. Emma was quiet for a moment. He came here because of Thomas, she said finally. He came here because of Thomas, Mrs. Dupree agreed. And he stayed because of you. Those are two entirely different things, and you know it. Emma set the shirt down in her lap and looked at her hands. The light in the parlor was afternoon gold, warm and honest, and the sound of the street came in through the half-open window, the creak and movement of a living town. I'm not beautiful, Emma said. It was not self-pity. It was just a fact she stated, the way you state that the ground is dry or the water is cold. No, Mrs. Dupree said with complete lack of cruelty. And he's not looking for beautiful. He's looking for real. There are men in this world who know the difference. Emma sat with that for a moment. Then she picked the shirt back up and went on darning, and Mrs. Dupree, having said what she came to say, left her alone with it. On a Tuesday in late September, when the first hint of fall was touching the mornings with a slight edge of cold that would eventually become serious, Arthur came to the boarding house not in the evening as usual but in the middle of the afternoon, and he was wearing a clean shirt and had made some effort with his hair, which told Emma that he had planned this. He asked her if she would ride out with him to the ranch. He had something he wanted her to see, he said. She went. He had borrowed a second horse from Domingo for her, a gentle gray mare who was well-mannered on the trail, and they rode the 12 miles northwest in the long golden afternoon, with the dry grass on either side of the track shimmering in a slight breeze and the sky enormous and blue above them. Emma had not been on horseback much in recent years, and she had forgotten how different the world looks from a horse's back, larger and more immediate at the same time. Arthur talked during the ride with the easy conversation of a man who is comfortable with where he's going. He told her about the progress on the buildings. The main house frame was up, the barn was nearly finished, the first fencing of the south pasture was half done. He had put in an order for a small cattle herd to be driven up from a ranch south of San Antonio, 12 longhorn cows and 2 bulls, which would arrive in October. When they reached the property, Emma saw what he had made. The house frame stood solid and clean in the late afternoon light, the cut lumber pale and bright, smelling of pine sap and new wood. The barn beside it was nearly finished, its roof boards weathered enough already to show that Domingo and Will Birch had been working steadily. The south pasture fence stretched in clean lines toward the cottonwood trees, and the creek, which Emma could hear before she could see, ran with a clear soft sound through the grassy bottom land. She sat on the gray mare for a moment and took it in. It's good land, she said. It's better than I expected, Arthur said from beside her. Come down and walk with me. They walked along the creek for a while, through the cottonwood shade where the light broke into moving pieces, and the water moved over smooth stones with that particular softness that running water has in dry country. Emma took off her gloves and crouched at the bank and put her hand in the water, which was cold and clear. Thomas would have liked this, she said. He would have, Arthur agreed. He was standing a few feet behind her, looking not at the creek but at her. She stood up and turned, and they were closer than the creek walk had suggested, and she could see in his face everything that Mrs. Dupree had said was there, all of it visible now without concealment. Emma, he said, and he said it quietly and carefully, the way you say something you've been carrying for a long time. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. I came here because of Thomas, he said. I want you to know that's still true, but somewhere between then and now, I've stopped thinking of this as a debt I owe a dead man. I've started thinking of it as he stopped and then went on with the directness that was the most characteristic thing about him. As something I want, for myself, because of you, not because of Thomas. The creek moved quietly beside them. The cottonwood leaves rattled gently overhead. I know you may not feel the same way, he said, and I'm not trying to make anything difficult between us. If you'd rather things stayed as they are, I can make my peace with that." Emma Grady, who had spent a good deal of her life being overlooked and undervalued, who had made a practice of keeping her expectations modest and her needs small, who had watched the world divide itself into people who were wanted and people who managed without it, looked at Arthur Warren standing in the cottonwood light with his clean shirt and his honest face and his careful, genuine heart, and felt something in her that had been very tightly held let go. "I don't want things to stay as they are," she said. He was still for a moment as if making sure he had heard correctly. "I have been paying attention," she said, "for quite a while, and I know my own mind." She met his gaze directly. "I feel the same way." In case that wasn't clear, something opened in his face that she had not seen before, a kind of unguarded joy that he was too honest to suppress and too dignified to make a spectacle of, and it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen on a person. He reached out and took her hand, very gently, and held it. Her hand was rougher than a woman in a novel's hand would have been, roughened by years of sewing and hard water and practical work, but he held it as if it were the most precious thing he had touched. "Good," he said, and though it was a simple word, it was so full of feeling that it was worth 10 speeches. They stood by the creek for a while in the September afternoon and talked, and the talking was different now, lighter and warmer, with a new quality to it that was relief and happiness mixed together in a way that is only possible between two people who have both been afraid. He told her about his plans for the house, 3 rooms to begin with, a kitchen and 2 sleeping rooms, and then more as the ranch grew. He told her about the well he needed to dig and the smokehouse he wanted to build, and the garden that the land near the creek could support if someone tended it. She told him she could build a garden. She had grown up with one. She told him she knew how to smoke meat that Thomas had taught her. She told him, almost shyly, that she had thought more than once about what it would be like to have a real home again, not a borrowed room in someone else's house. "This will be a real home," he said, looking at the frame of the house against the sky. "I intend to make it one." She believed him. The ride back to Harlan Creek was easy and warm, the sky gone to deep orange and pink above the flat horizon, and they rode side by side with their horses, shoulders nearly touching, and talked about nothing in particular, which is what people in love do when there is nothing left to be nervous about. Harlan Creek, when they arrived back, noted their arrival and noted the quality of it, and the conversation shifted accordingly. Mrs. Hartley saw them come in from the porch and permitted herself a small, satisfied smile. Mrs. Dupree, who had been watching from the parlor window, nodded once with the vindication of the perpetually right. Clarence, the telegraph operator, who had a romantic soul hidden under his professional exterior, told Will Birch about it at the Dusty Crown, and they agreed it was a good development. Cutter said something sour and uncharitable, but even his regulars were beginning to find him tiresome on the subject of Arthur Warren, and nobody agreed with him out loud. Over the following weeks, the courtship deepened in the way that honest courtships do, not in dramatic declarations, but in the steady accumulation of shared time and growing trust. Arthur came to supper every evening now when he was not kept at the ranch by something urgent, and he and Emma spent the evenings on the porch or in the parlor, reading and talking, and being easy with each other in a way that was new to both of them. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, but with Emma he was warm in small, quiet ways that meant more than demonstration. A hand on the small of her back as they went through a door, a cup of coffee already prepared the way she liked it, the way he listened to everything she said with his whole attention. She, in turn, was learning the language of his particular reticence, learning that the stillness in him was not coldness but depth, that when he said little it was because he was feeling a great deal and handling it carefully, and that the best way to reach him was simply to be steady and present and unfrightened. In October, the cattle arrived. 12 longhorn cows and 2 bulls, driven up from the south by a small crew that Arthur paid and sent back, And the day they arrived at the ranch, Emma rode out with Mrs. Hartley, who had decided to make it a social occasion, and brought a basket with cold chicken and corn bread and a jar of sweet tea. Well, Birch and Domingo worked the cattle into the south pasture with the practiced efficiency of men who know what they're doing, and Arthur stood at the fence and watched with a quiet pride that was wonderful to see. "You've done it," Emma said beside him. "We've made a start," he said, with his characteristic refusal to call anything finished before it was. She looked at the cattle moving through the new grass of the south pasture and felt something she could only describe as being part of something, being woven into the fabric of a place and a life, and it was a feeling she had not known since before her father died, and she had become a person who moved through the world rather than belonging to any piece of it. He proposed to her in November, 6 weeks after the cattle arrived. It was not a grand occasion. They were sitting at the creek bank in the late afternoon, with the last of the autumn warmth on their faces and the cottonwood trees bare now above them, the leaves gone, the branches making clean lines against a pale sky. He had been quiet for most of the ride out, the kind of quiet that was preparation rather than absence, and she had let him have it, knowing by now when he was working up to something. "Emma," he said. "Yes," she said, already knowing. "I want you to be my wife." He looked at her directly, without ceremony but with complete seriousness. "I want to build that house for you as much as for me, or more. I want to put your name on that land the same as mine. I know it's not a fancy life I'm offering, and I know the ranch is still more promise than fact, but I want you beside me for all of it. The building and the working and whatever comes after." He paused. "I love you. I should have said that plainly before now, but you know I'm better at showing than saying." Emma looked at him, and everything inside her was warm and certain and steady. "You say it just fine," she told him. "And yes, my answer is yes." He took her face in both his hands carefully, as if she might be different after this moment, which she was, and he kissed her for the first time, there by the creek in the November afternoon, and it was gentle and then not, and it was everything. They were married in the Harlan Creek church on a Saturday in December, with Reverend Tillman officiating, and the entire town in attendance, because a wedding in a small town is everyone's occasion whether they are invited or not. Mrs. Hartley had organized a reception afterward in the boarding house parlor that had expanded through a series of what she called practical additions into an event that involved most of the food in town and a fiddle player named Garcia who came in from 20 miles east and played until his arms gave out. Emma wore a dress she had made herself, ivory-colored wool with a collar of real lace that she had sewn by lamplight in the weeks before the wedding, and she was not the most beautiful bride anyone had ever seen, but she was the most content, and that was visible in a way that beauty alone cannot be. A kind of light from inside that made people who had never paid much attention to Emma Grady look at her and think that they had been missing something. Arthur stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that fit him properly for perhaps the first time in his life. Mrs. Hartley had insisted on having it properly altered, and when Emma walked in on the arm of Domingo, who had accepted the role of her escort with a grave and dignified pleasure, Arthur's face did the thing that it had done that afternoon by the creek, the unguarded joy that he couldn't and didn't try to suppress, and several women in the church who had been somewhat skeptical about the whole enterprise found themselves unexpectedly moved. Mrs. Dupree cried, which she did with the defiant composure of a woman who cries exactly when she wants to and is not embarrassed about it. Cutter, the saloon owner, did not attend the wedding. He was the only person in Harlan Creek who did not, and his absence was noted and generally taken as an indication of his character rather than his schedule. They moved into the ranch house 3 weeks after the wedding, on a cold January day when the sky was the color of pewter, and the creek was running high with winter rain. The house was not finished. The third room was still framed but not plastered. The kitchen floor was bare boards that needed sealing, and the chimney smoked more than it should until Arthur spent 2 days on the roof adjusting the flashing. But it was theirs, entirely and completely, and that made it perfect in the way that only belonging can make an imperfect thing perfect. Emma brought her books and her sewing kit, and the small carved box that had been her mother's, and the quilt she had made herself the first winter in Harlan Creek. And when she set these things in the rooms of the house, she felt something in her settle and take root. Something she had not been aware was unrooted until the moment it was finally, firmly planted. She started a garden in the spring, in the shelter of the south wall of the house where the sun hit early, and the soil near the creek was dark and rich. She planted kitchen vegetables, first beans, squash, tomatoes, corn, and then, in a corner she kept separately, flowers, because Thomas had always said that flowers were the way you tell the world you intend to stay. The ranch grew steadily through that first year of their marriage. Arthur and Domingo and Will Birch worked through the long Texas days with the patient industry of men who understand that building something real takes time and can't be rushed. The Longhorn herd grew as the cows calved in the spring, and Arthur made careful trades and sales at the Abilene market that brought in enough money to hire a third hand, a solid man of 30 named Eli Cooper, who had come west from Tennessee and who proved to be as reliable as his references suggested. Emma continued her sewing work, not because they needed the money urgently, but because she was good at it and she liked it, and because it gave her a thread of connection to Harlan Creek and its people, which she valued. She rode into town twice a week on the gray mare that Arthur had bought for her saddlebags full of finished work and empty of anything else. And gradually, the townspeople who had come to her with their mending and their alterations became something more than customers, became neighbors in the true sense, the people whose lives intersected with yours at the specific points where need and skill met. Mrs. Hartley retired from the boarding house in the summer, handing it over to her niece who had come down from Fort Worth, and the night before she left she came to the ranch for supper, which had become a regular occasion. She sat at Emma's table and ate Emma's food, and looked around the kitchen with its braided rug and the wildflower jar on the windowsill and the husband sitting across the table with his quiet, contented face, and she said, with the directness that had always been her finest quality, "I am so glad you stayed in Harlan Creek, Emma." Emma looked at her, and at Arthur, and at the house around her that was her home in a way no place had been since childhood. "So am I," she said. There was a difficulty in the fall of their first married year that was not dramatic but was real. Arthur came in from a morning ride along the northern fence line looking troubled in a way that was new, and when Emma asked him what was wrong he told her that 3 sections of the fence had been cut in the night, and 4 of the Longhorn cattle were missing. It was cattle theft, a problem that was neither unusual in Texas in 1879 nor simple to address. Arthur rode to Harlan Creek and reported it to the county sheriff, a lean, methodical man named Henderson, who had been doing the job for 12 years and had no illusions about its difficulty. Sheriff Henderson came out to the ranch, looked at the fence and the hoofprints, and said he would investigate, which both Arthur and Emma took to mean they should not hold their breath. Will Birch, who was young and had ideas about this kind of thing, suggested riding after the missing cattle himself. Arthur told him carefully but firmly that going after cattle thieves alone, and without clear evidence of where they had gone, was not a practical or safe course of action, and that the cattle were insured against exactly this kind of loss through the stock association Arthur had joined in the spring. Emma watched how Arthur handled this, the measured response, the refusal to make it larger than it was, the practical attention to what could actually be done, and felt again the particular kind of respect that grows in a marriage between two people who are paying attention, the respect that goes beyond love and makes love deeper. The cattle were never recovered, but the insurance covered the loss, and Arthur restrung the fence with a double run of wire that fall, and there was no further incident. In December of that first year, Emma realized she was expecting their first child. She told Arthur on a Thursday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the winter wind pressing at the windows and the warm smell of the house around them. She told him simply and directly, as she told him everything, and watched his face. He went very still for a moment, in the way that he went still when something mattered enormously. And then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it hard, and she could see that he was feeling everything at once, joy and terror and love and responsibility all arriving simultaneously. And he said nothing for a moment because what he was feeling was too large for immediate words. "Are you well?" he finally asked, which was characteristic and endearing and exactly right. "I'm very well," she said, "tired in the mornings, but very well." "Then everything is—" he stopped and then said very quietly, "Thomas would have been so happy." She felt the familiar warm ache of that, the love and the loss together, and she nodded. "He would have been a wonderful uncle," she said, "absolutely terrible at not spoiling them." Arthur laughed, and it was the best laugh, full and warm, and she laughed with him. Their son was born in August of 1881, in the bedroom of the ranch house, with the window open to the summer morning, and Mrs. Hartley's niece, who turned out to have considerable practical experience in such matters, attending along with a doctor who had come to Harlan Creek the previous year. They named him Thomas Arthur Warren, Thomas first and without discussion, because both of them had known from the beginning what his name would be if he was a boy. He was a large, healthy, opinionated baby who made his presence known with a vigor that suggested he had inherited the louder qualities of his uncle rather than the quieter ones of his father. And Arthur held him that first morning with the same carefully contained joy that Emma had come to know as his deepest expression of feeling, looking down at his son's face, as if committing every detail to memory. "He looks like you," Emma said from the bed, which was not entirely accurate but was the right thing to say. "He looks like nobody I've ever seen," Arthur said. "He looks entirely like himself," which was also true. The years that followed, 1881, 1882, 1883, were years of growth and deepening and the particular richness of a life being built properly. The ranch expanded. Arthur bought the adjacent 160 acres to the north in 1882, extending the property to the creek tributary that fed into the main stream, and the cattle herd grew to 60 head by the end of that year, large enough to make a respectable showing at the Abilene market, and to justify the additional expense of a fourth ranch hand. Little Thomas grew from a vigorous infant into a determined and curious toddler who had his mother's gray eyes and his father's steady way of looking at things, and who showed a particular fascination with horses that delighted Domingo, who had no children of his own, and whose informal adoption of Thomas as an honorary nephew was one of the warmer things that happened on the Warren Ranch during those years. Emma's garden spread and flourished. She added fruit trees, an apple and 2 peach trees, in the spring of 1882, knowing she would be waiting years for their fruit, but also knowing that she was not going anywhere and had the luxury of planting for the future. The flower corner expanded into a proper flower border along the front of the house, and in the summer it was vivid with color in a way that made the house visible from half a mile away, which Emma found deeply satisfying. She continued her sewing, though by 1882 it had grown from practical mending work into something more considered. She had begun making clothes properly, dresses and coats and children's garments, with a skill and an attention to detail that had developed over years, and was now producing work that people came from the neighboring towns to commission. She was known in the region as the best seamstress between Harlan Creek and Abilene, which was not a small thing in a time and place where decent ready-made clothing was expensive and rare. One afternoon in the summer of 1882, Arthur came in from the back pasture to find Emma sitting on the porch with a letter in her hand and an expression on her face that was complicated. "What is it?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "A letter from a woman in Dallas," she said. "A Mrs. Partridge. She says she had a dress from me 3 years ago, when her sister came through Harlan Creek and bought it for her. She says it was the best dress she ever owned, and she wants to commission a complete wardrobe, 6 gowns and several other pieces, and she'll pay very well. She looked up. She wants to know if I'll come to Dallas for a month to take measurements and fittings. Arthur looked at her steadily. Do you want to go? I want your opinion first, she said. I think, he said carefully, that you are an extraordinary seamstress, and that a woman in Dallas with the money for 6 gowns is a serious patron, and that if you want to go, you should go. Thomas is not yet weaned, she said. Thomas is being weaned, Arthur said, which was true. The boy was 14 months old and eating enthusiastically. And Mrs. Hartley's niece has offered to help more times than I can count, and I am here. The ranch can spare me some hours each day. She looked at him. You would manage. We would manage, he said. But more importantly, do you want to go? She thought about it seriously. She thought about Dallas, which was a real city with stores and restaurants and hotels, and about what it would be like to work on something ambitious and well-funded. She thought about Mrs. Partridge and 6 gowns, about the challenge and the craft of it. I think I might, she said slowly. Then you should, he said. She went to Dallas for 3 weeks in September of 1882, leaving Thomas in the capable hands of Arthur and Mrs. Hartley's niece, and she came back with money enough to buy a proper sewing machine, a treadle model that Horace Pell ordered specially for her from a catalog, and with 3 further commissions from women Mrs. Partridge had recommended her to. The work Emma did from the ranch. The sewing she had always quietly been good at became something that she was known for, something that was hers in a specific and particular way that was distinct from the ranch, distinct from being Arthur's wife or Thomas's mother, belonging entirely to her own skill and her own judgment. Arthur saw this and was proud of it in the way he was proud of things, without making speeches, but with a constancy of support and interest that communicated everything. You should charge more, he said one evening, going over her commission records with the same methodical attention he applied to the ranch accounts. I charge what the work is worth, she said. You charge what you think people will pay without complaint, he said, which is less than the work is worth. She looked at him for a moment, because he was right, and because she had spent enough of her life making herself small and affordable that the habit was deeply ingrained. You could be right, she said carefully. I am right, he said, without arrogance, just certainty. You are the best seamstress in this part of Texas, and you should be paid accordingly. She raised her prices the following month. Nobody stopped commissioning her work. In the spring of 1883, Emma was expecting their second child, and this time the knowledge settled into their life with the easy comfort of something familiar and deeply welcome. Thomas, who was nearly 2 and had developed strong opinions about everything, was told he was going to have a sibling and processed this information with characteristic intensity before deciding that it was probably fine. The second child, born in October of 1883, was a girl. They named her Margaret, after Arthur's mother, and she was small and dark-haired, and had Arthur's steady gray eyes and a face that would eventually be beautiful in the way that strong-featured women are beautiful, with a quality that goes beyond arrangement into something more lasting. The ranch prospered. The house grew. The garden flourished. The cattle herd reached 100 head, and the Abilene market knew Arthur Warren's Longhorns as reliable and well-handled. Domingo married a woman from a nearby ranch in 1884 and brought her to live in the small stone house Arthur had built for the senior hands, and Will Birch, who had grown from a willing 22-year-old into a thoroughly competent 27-year-old, was made foreman of the ranch operation. Harlan Creek grew too, in the way of Texas towns in the 1880s, steadily and without great fanfare. The railroad spur that had been promised and then canceled was re-promised and then actually delivered in 1884, a narrow branch line that connected Harlan Creek to the main cattle shipping line at Abilene, and the town got a proper train depot and 2 new businesses and a hotel that was much better than nothing. The school expanded, and Emma served on the school board for 3 years, which she found satisfying in direct proportion to how much work it was. Cutter, the saloon owner who had been the one consistent source of small-minded commentary about Emma and Arthur's relationship, sold the Dusty Crown in 1884 and left Harlan Creek for reasons that nobody was entirely clear on, but that seemed to involve a gambling debt in Abilene. Nobody particularly missed him, and the new owner of the Dusty Crown was a pleasant woman named Nancy Foss, who ran a cleaner and better managed establishment, and who became, in time, a good friend of Emma's. Sheriff Henderson, who had handled the cattle theft with imperfect but honest effort, retired in 1885, and the town elected a younger man named Carter who turned out to be very good at the job. The region was quieter by 1885 than it had been in earlier years. The wildest days of the cattle drives were settling into something more organized, the frontier becoming less frontier and more settled country. But there was still enough of the old roughness to make Carter's competence valuable. On a September evening in 1885, Arthur and Emma sat on the front porch of their house, the porch that Arthur had built onto the front of the house in 1882, wide and shaded and furnished with 2 rocking chairs that had been a wedding gift from Mrs. Hartley, and watched the last light go off the sky while Thomas, now 4 years old, chased fireflies across the front yard with the total dedication of a small person who has found his purpose, and Margaret, not yet 2, slept in Emma's arms with the boneless heavy peace of a sleeping child. The creek was running quietly in the distance. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The lights of Harlan Creek were visible to the southeast, a low warm glow against the darkening sky. The apple tree in the garden had given its second real crop that summer, and there were jars of apple preserves in the kitchen that Emma had put up last week. "Are you happy?" Arthur asked. It was not the kind of question he asked often. He asked it now with the simplicity of a man who genuinely wants the answer, who has not yet taken things for granted and does not intend to. Emma looked at the fireflies and her son and the land stretching dark and quiet in every direction, and then she looked at Arthur, at his face in the fading light, older now than when he had ridden into town asking for the plainest name in the register, more settled, more here. "Yes," she said, "completely." He nodded slowly, and she could see the satisfaction in it, the deep, quiet contentment of a man who has built what he set out to build and found that it was good. He reached over and covered her free hand with his, and they sat that way while Thomas's firefly hunting gradually wound down into the sleepy stumbling of a child who was going to need carrying inside very soon. "I think about Thomas sometimes," Emma said. "My brother, what he would make of all this." "He would have been very loud about it," Arthur said, and there was warmth in it as well as sadness, the way there always is when you have learned to hold grief and love in the same hand. "He would have taken the credit," Emma said, and laughed, and it was a laugh with tears underneath it, the way the best laughter is. "He'd have been right too," Arthur said, in a manner of speaking. She looked at him. "You're the one who kept the promise." "He's the one who asked me to," Arthur said quietly. "And he was the one who knew, before I did, that you were someone worth crossing Texas for." Emma sat with that for a moment, with the weight and the warmth of it. She had spent so much of her life believing herself unremarkable, a plain name on a list, someone people passed over looking for something better. She had made her peace with it. She had built a life around it. She had armored herself in practicality and competence and the quiet satisfaction of good work. And then a man had ridden into Harlan Creek and asked for her by name out of all the names in all the registers in all the towns in Texas, and had refused to find her unremarkable no matter how hard she had first expected him to. "He was right," she said finally, "about all of it." Arthur squeezed her hand. "He usually was about important things." Thomas came stumbling across the grass then, tired and enormously pleased with himself, and held up both his cupped hands to show his parents the single firefly he had finally managed to catch, its light pulsing softly between his fingers. "Look," he said. "Look, Mama, Papa, I caught the light." Emma looked at the firefly, which was very small and very bright, and then at her son's face, and then at her husband, who was looking at the same things with the same expression she knew was on her own face. "So you did," she said. "Let it go now, sweetheart. Let it go home." Thomas opened his hands carefully, and they all watched the firefly rise and join the others moving through the dark grass, a small traveling light making its way toward wherever it was going. "Come inside now," Arthur said, standing up and lifting Thomas onto his hip in one easy movement, the boy immediately wrapping his arms around his father's neck with the absolute trust of a child who has never had a reason to doubt. "It's getting cold." Emma stood too, with Margaret still sleeping warm and heavy in her arms, and followed her husband through the front door of the house they had built together, into the lamplit kitchen, into the smell of the supper she had made and the warmth of the fire, and all the solid, particular evidence of a life that had been built out of nothing but a promise and a plain name in a boarding house register, and two people who had been paying attention. She set Margaret down in her small bed in the corner of the kitchen where it was warmest, and covered her with the quilt that had come from the boarding house in Harlan Creek, and stood for a moment looking at her daughter's sleeping face. Arthur came and stood beside her, Thomas already drowsing on his shoulder, and they stood together the way they stood together, the way they had learned to stand together, with the particular ease of people who have been through seasons and work and grief and joy in each other's company, and have found the shape that fits. "I need to tell you something," Emma said quietly. He looked at her. "I think there is going to be a third one," she said. Arthur was still for a moment in the way he went still, and then his face did the thing it always did, and she loved him for never having learned to hide it. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not yet," she said, "but I think so." He put his free arm around her and pulled her close, gently because of the sleeping children, and pressed his lips to her temple, and she could feel him smiling against her hair. "Good," he said. The same word he had said that first time, by the creek in the September afternoon, and it meant everything then and everything now. She leaned into him and felt the warmth of the house around them, and the dark, rich land outside, and the stars coming out over Texas in their old, reliable abundance. And she thought of Thomas, her brother, whose love had sent this man to her across 200 miles of dry country. And she thought of herself as she had been, sitting in a small back room mending other people's things, convinced she was as plain and unremarkable as her name, and that this was simply what her life was going to be. And she thought of what a life actually is, how it is not a thing you are given but a thing you make, and how making it requires someone willing to make it with you, and how sometimes that someone arrives in a completely unexpected way, asking a question that sets the whole town wondering and turns out to be the truest thing that has ever happened to you. The fire settled in the grate. Margaret breathed softly in her corner. Thomas was fully asleep now against his father's shoulder, his firefly-chasing hands limp and sweet in sleep. Outside, the creek ran on in the dark, and the cattle settled in the pasture, and the apple tree stood its ground in the garden, and the land that had been raw and empty was now, completely and irrevocably, home. Emma turned the lamp down low, and Arthur carried Thomas to bed and came back for Margaret, and they moved through the house together in the comfortable darkness, doing the small necessary things that are the real substance of a life. And when everything was settled and quiet, they came to their own room, and the window was open to the night air, and the stars were enormous and closed the way they are in flat country with no city light to argue with them. Arthur lay down beside her, and she turned toward him, and he put his arm around her, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was steady and sure and entirely familiar, the most familiar sound in her life. "I love you," she said. She did not say it as often as some people do. She said it when she meant it with her whole self. "I love you," he said, and held her closer. And outside, the Texas night was deep and clear and full of stars. And in the house that had been built from nothing on land that had been bare, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of ways lay still in the dark and were, without question or complication, entirely, peacefully, completely at home. The third child was born the following summer, a boy they named Robert James, red-faced and demanding and immediately besotted with his older sister in a way that amused Thomas enormously. Well, Birch built them a new cradle as a gift, made from cottonwood from the stand along the creek, and it was beautiful in the plain, unadorned way that good handwork is beautiful. Domingo's wife brought food for 2 weeks straight and organized the kitchen with a cheerful efficiency that left Emma both grateful and mildly outflanked. Mrs. Hartley's niece, who by now felt like family in every sense that mattered, stood at the stove and told anyone who would listen that she had known from the day Arthur Warren walked into that boarding house that this was exactly how it was all going to turn out. Arthur, holding his second son on the morning of the boy's second day in the world, looked across at Emma with the full weight of everything he felt for her visible in his face and said, simply, "We've done all right." Emma, who was tired and content and had never been more certain of anything in her life, said, "We've done better than all right, Arthur. We have done very well indeed." He smiled, and it was the smile she had first seen by the creek 6 years ago, and it had not changed, and she thought it never would, and she was right. The ranch grew and the children grew, and the seasons turned over the Texas land with their old reliable rhythm, hot and dry and sometimes hard and sometimes beautiful beyond any words for it. And Emma Grady, Emma Warren now, though she kept Grady too, because it was Thomas's name and she would not lose it, entirely lived her life with both hands open, giving and receiving in equal measure, plain and capable and entirely beloved, which is a rarer and more valuable thing than beautiful. And she knew it now down to her bones. The fireflies came back every summer, and every summer Thomas taught his younger siblings how to cup their hands just right, and every summer one of them eventually got up in the morning and said, "Look, I caught the light." And every summer Emma and Arthur watched from the porch in the good Texas dark and felt the whole weight of their life together settle around them like something warm and permanent, like the land itself, like the running creek. Like everything that had been built from nothing and would outlast everything and would be, in the end, the truest thing either of them had ever made. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.